Graverobber. Chapter 1. Luxury's Lap. Born into money and married into more, she spent her days on horseback and her evenings in the ballroom. She was the object of her husband's boorish lust and drunken temper, placating his worst tendencies with a veneer of gracious deference, all the while indulging murderous fantasies of freedom and the fortune that would soon be hers. Chapter 2. Nightcap. Night after night of disrespect and abuse, enough was enough. She listened, smirking, as his empty apologies came in desperate, choking gags. Chapter 3. Embarrassment of riches. Years of decadence and financial mismanagement had left the estate in staggering debt. Humiliated and facing eviction, she wandered the empty halls, hurling inebriated indignities at the portrait of the deceased, whose hand had rested so possessively upon her shoulder. A gleam of gold on that painted paw reminded her that his rings were unaccounted for, and must have been buried with him. Chapter 4. Filthy Rich. To preserve her social standing, she would pilfer the rings from his fingers, the gold from his teeth. She was awash in exhilaration, the glint in her eyes outshining the fistful of ill-gotten gains. Chapter 5. The After Party. Armed officials dispatched to oversee the eviction were shocked to find the front doors listlessly ajar. The lavish carpets were lousy with dirt and leaves. A heap of heirlooms gleamed on the ballroom floor, rings and brooches in a careless pile. The lady of the manor, however, was nowhere to be found. Hellion. Chapter 1. The Eve of Glory. She was young to join the war band, but any who challenged her readiness were met with clenched fists and violent indignation. Having bloodied the last of her detractors, the matter was considered finally settled. On the eve of battle, she joined her clanmates in a raucous celebration, her stein and her spirits overflowing with abundance. Chapter 2. The Brave. She was the tip of the spear, poised to sunder the enemy line, to live forever in the songs of her people. Her entire life spent in preparation, but when it mattered most, she had failed. Chapter 3. Night in the Woods. As the advancing army moved on, she huddled tightly in the tree's clammy roots, hoping to be somehow swallowed up into the earth. At dawn, she woke tormented by the exuberant cries of carrion crows, come to feast upon the corpses of her kin. When at last she stirred, the scavengers took flight, repulsed by the sight of this undeserving revenant. Chapter 4. Shame and Exile. She had shunned a warrior's death, and her cowardice would be impugned. They cast her out, an exile, unwelcome and unsung. Chapter 5. The Great Emptiness. Alone and untethered, she wandered the countryside, fighting for sport and soaking her wounds in wine. She sought death at every turn, desperate for a second chance to prove her mettle. but it seemed even that terrible wraith had forsaken her. Her isolation was absolute, her shame barely concealed by a fragile facade of fearlessness. Highwayman, Chapter 1. Freedom. A prison riot, a fleeting chance to escape incarceration. He would be a fugitive, a hunted man, but a free one nonetheless. Chapter 2. Laying low. Harried by a pursuing garrison, he took refuge in the fetid canals of the city. Concealment took its toll, and soon he began to see himself in the furtive, scurrying pests that formed an unfortunate portion of his meager diet. Freedom, once so fondly imagined, had become a vortex of degradation. Chapter 3. One last job. He was sick and starving, and in desperation offered his expertise to an unscrupulous malefactor. Shackled once more to an unsavory task by an advance of gold, he lined his belly, girded himself, and prepared for one final heist. Chapter 4. Highway Robbery. The stagecoach arrived, and he set himself to the business of bloodshed and robbery. He fulfilled his obligations with exceptional lethality, but his grim satisfaction would prove short-lived. Chapter 5. Shackled. The lifeless bodies of a woman and child, horribly mutilated by errant gunfire, stared spectrally through the remnants of the coach door. Arrested by the ghoulish sight, he felt the cold chains of remorse tighten around his heart. Guilt was a pursuer he could never outrun, a prison he would never escape. Jester. Chapter 1. Some strange melody. He was a layabout without aspiration or purpose, content to loiter on street corners, languidly busking for passers-by. Roughly ushered from the bustling commercial blocks, he wandered the forgotten corners of the city. An intoxicating melody drifted over a nearby cemetery wall, and he stumbled deliriously amongst the tombstones in search of the performer. Chapter 2. Music of the Night. He could learn this unearthly hymn and claim it as his own. Ambition, so long dormant within him, had been roused. He delighted in fantasies of fame, renown, and respect. Chapter 3. Play to the crowd. When word of his uncommon talent reached the palace, he was summoned to entertain king and court. Anticipating an historic performance and enthused adulation, he was stunned to find himself instead the object of their debased ridicule. While his noble audience dined drunkenly, he was mocked, tortured, and subjected to an obscene array of dangerous and decadent humiliations. Chapter 4. A Dark Song. He unleashed his resentment upon instrument and crowd, playing the demoniac melody with unrestrained fury. This was the song of the dead, and it had exacted a fitting tribute. Chapter 5. Finale. Bowing low, he basked in the echoing applause of dripping blood. The scene of wholesale dismemberment drove him to fits of mirthless hysterics. He was laughing still as he placed the blade against his own hand, severing his connection to whatever twisted talent he had so fleetingly enjoyed. Aimlessly he drifted from the hall, humming broken bars of a discordant melody he could not quite remember. Man-at-Arms. Chapter 1. A premature promotion. The politics of a military career are perhaps as treacherous as war itself. Though untested in combat, his acumen for advancement was unmatched. Through a dubious campaign of influence and intimidation, he had at last claimed a coveted command, and was eager to bask in the glory of the victories that were sure to come. Chapter 2. A Leader of Men. Behold the conquering general, marching his men to victory. A rout, a massacre, a complete and total failure of command. Chapter 3. One Eye Open. Every night, the men of his regiment would interrupt his fitful convalescence. Mutilated and maimed, the spectral garrison clawed at his bed covers, whispering hateful truths in his ears. The exhausted attendants in the field hospital would wake to the sound of panicked screaming and inglorious sobs. It was not the war that had taken his eye. It was pride. Chapter 4. Ghosts of the Past. Demoted and disgraced, he returned to the battlefield, ready to endure the wrath of his regiment and grant them some small peace. At last, he would sleep undisturbed, and perhaps find some comfort in that murky abyss of dreamless wonder. Chapter 5. In the Trenches. He resolved to spend his remaining years seeking atonement in the trenches of bloody battlefields the world over. For him, there could be no respite from the horrors of war, and when at last he was struck down, he would die alone and unremembered. Surely, he deserved no better. Occultist. Chapter 1. The Ritual. On certain portentous evenings carefully selected for their astrological potency, he would gather his devotees around the ancient onyx table, and joining hands with them, would send his spirit out into the void. Safely tethered by their vital energies, he was free to wander the outer spheres in search of some dark communion and impossible power. Chapter 2. A Door in the Desert. He found himself in a vast expanse of windswept dunes. Ahead, the stone spires of a pyramidal temple called down jagged bolts from a rolling, angry sky. Undaunted, he crossed the threshold of the towering aperture, settled himself upon the central dais, and prepared for the coming sacrifice. Chapter 3. Some parts must die. Terrible though it was, he would pay the price for power. The emptiness in him called out across boundless gulfs of unknown space, for nature abhors a vacuum. Chapter 4. The Guest. Drawing vitality from the assembled mediums, he would hold fast against the thing and harness a portion of its power. imbued with strange currents of infernal origin, his apotheosis was complete. Chapter 5. An Eternal Flame. Emerging from his trance, he met the charred, steaming corpses of his acolytes with a shudder. He could sense the eldritch entity stalking the edges of his consciousness, probing for weaknesses. He had become a beacon, a conduit to unknown regions, and would be assailed by those blasphemous forces all the rest of his days. Plague Doctor. Chapter 1. The Good Student. Brilliant and bold, her unconventional theories created nothing short of a scandal in her 4th year. The mocking whispers and scornful glares of her peers and professors had an ironically invigorating effect upon her extracurricular experiments. The mysteries of the human body, of life and death itself, hovered just beyond her scalpel's reach. If only she could acquire a corpse of sufficient freshness. Chapter 2. Head of the Class. Her professor was a relic, hacking and wheezing his way through a hopelessly conventional curriculum. She delighted in the combative debate, and behind her bookish glasses, reveled in their outrage and confusion. Chapter 3. Extra Credit. By the 2nd semester, her research was at a critical point, and regular supply raids of the university laboratories had become necessary. During one such expedition, she stumbled upon her professor, awkwardly slumped over his podium, a bloody kerchief on the floor. Here, then, was her ideal cadaver, her long-awaited opportunity, and she would not waste it. Chapter 4. Failing Grade. Success. Vindication. The human machine restored to action. The shrieking and wailing was horrible, but the silence that followed was even worse. Chapter 5. Do no harm. Disposal of the body was a procedural affair. A carboy of acid would dissolve the thing and no evidence would remain. In the weeks that followed, however, she found herself unable to focus, sitting motionless at her desk, paralyzed by the ceaseless wailing that reverberated in her mind. Runaway. Chapter 1. The Pigs of St. Martha's. Her pious caretakers had marked her for the last time. Tonight, she would escape their cruelty at last. She ran blindly into the rain, the squeals of the pursuing sisters lost in the howling wind. Chapter 2. Beloved. Good fortune is a rare and wondrous thing. She straggled from place to place, drenched and hungry, until a kindly woodsman and his wife happened upon her. Childless themselves, they welcomed her into their home, where she warmed herself in the glow of their hearth and hearts. Chapter 3. Drawn to the Flame. She would stay up long into the night, tending the fire. Captivated by its shifting hues, she thrilled to the eerie dance of spark and ember, running her fingers absent-mindedly over the scars that patterned her arm. The hearthlight seemed somehow alive, and in these private moments, she yearned to reach out and be touched once again by its searing embrace. Chapter 4. burnt offering. An accident, but surely there was time to contain the flames. The walls were alight. There was no stopping it now. Chapter 5. Ashes. She stood in the center of the inferno, transfixed by its swirling kaleidoscopic beauty. Her rapturous fixation was cut short by a heavy beam falling from the ceiling, blocking the door. Panicked, she dove headlong through a window as the cabin bloomed into a pyre. Heaped upon the wet grass, she heard the screams of her adoptive parents, trapped and burning in their bedroom.